Welcome back to Behind the Play. My name is Alex Adams, and today I am joined by Luke Fox, once again of Sportsnet, who covers the Leafs and the NHL. And just, I love your work. You always feel like you have a pulse on the Leafs and the market, and obviously know a lot about the NHL as well. So thanks so much, Luke, for coming on. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Alex. Happy to be back, return guest. I must have done something right the first time.
Oh, you definitely did. Just before we get into the weeds of it, Luke, I need your phone and I need you to show me all the pictures that you've had, just so the guests and I kind of know you a bit better. Now that you're a recurring guest, we need to feel that sense of, connection.
Yeah. Are you gonna airplay it so your whole family can see my
Yeah,
phone?
exactly. That's
Yeah.
that's that's I'm asking Zoom, I'm putting in a request so I can do that, just
Okay.
so all my guests feel much more closer. But yeah, Luke, just what do you make? You've written about the Mike Babcock situation, and we'll get into that. But what do you make of this whole just a mess of a situation in Columbus with Mike Babcock and, as you mentioned, the airplay and the phones?
Yeah, it's a really wild scenario. The fact that, it was a controversial hire when they made it. He's been out of the game, but collecting checks since 2019. Came with a lot of baggage, quite the reputation, but he's won championships, international and Stanley Cups. And I guess based on the people they asked, they thought this was a good idea. So Jarmo Kekalainen and John Davidson went with this gamble. And my goodness, I can't recall a scenario like this where you don't even get to day one of camp, let alone preseason, let alone an actual game. A coach that you spent $8 million on originally. I'm sure they settled for less than that, but I'm sure he got a chunk of it. And all of a sudden he's gone. And I think there's a lot of takeaways you can make from this. One is, I think, the power of Paul Bissonnette and Spit and Chicklets that put this on the radar and didn't back down when, Johnny Gaudreau. I was in Vegas in the room when Gaudreau was speaking. When Johnny Gaudreau came out and said his interaction was fine. When Boone Jenner said, nothing to see here. Babcock himself said this was grossly misrepresented, but Bissonnette didn't back down. And I think more importantly, the NHLPA didn't just
Mm.
take those statements and shrug their shoulders. They were, Marty Walsh was in Vegas. He promptly, got on a plane and went down to Columbus, and the PA was very active. And I think if you're a player, I think you're probably encouraged by how serious the union heads, Ron Hainsey deserves credit as well, took this situation and dug a little deeper. I think it's a very bizarre story. I think Babcock didn't have a lot of friends in the hockey world, and not a lot of people came to his defense, and enough people came out. There was enough there that, Babcock and the Blue Jackets met and said, it's better if we just, wash our hands of each other. I'll take some money. I'll go away quietly. Pascal Vincent steps in, and what a tumultuous start to a season, though, for a team that really needs a bounce back. Hasn't been in the playoffs in a while, has young players. Maybe we look back and say this was a good thing in the long run. The fact that they didn't, go into the season with Babcock, maybe they get some traction. But what a wild story to kick off the start of the NHL season.
You mentioned and touched upon Paul Bissonnette, and like he I guess he reported it. It was on the podcast, but as someone in the media, what do you make of maybe the role of podcasts in terms of, like myself, but I'm not necessarily reporting on anything, but just in the hockey landscape, and maybe what the future of kind of, it feels as though there's maybe a player empowerment kind of movement coming to the NHL a little bit, and we see that with player coach relationships.
Yeah, and I think hockey's actually been relatively slow in that regard in terms of the player empowerment. It's hard to be quite honest. The players willing to take a hard stance on any issue are few and far between, and I understand why that is. Part of it's, hockey culture's become ingrained. It's more of a team sport than the other team sports. I really think you need, everyone on board. And there's just this tradition of guys not wanting to draw attention to themselves, always trying to put the we before the me. And I think there's good aspects to that, but I think it can be dangerous when guys are a little bit afraid to speak their mind. And even now, right? Like the player or players on the Blue Jackets are anonymous. So they didn't feel comfortable going the traditional route. But Paul Bissonnette is a former player himself. He has tight relationships. He's a guy they feel comfortable being candid with, or at least texting and letting this out. So yeah, it's not the traditional way that stories get broken, but I think it speaks to the power of Bissonnette in particular, Spit and Chicklets in general, and players feeling a little bit more comfortable getting their message out there. I think it's a good thing.
And someone who covered the Leafs for a while now, what do you make of like how does this shape the lens that you view the Mike Babcock era in Toronto?
Yeah, I don't know. That's a good question. I mean, one of the things that came out is that he had done this practice previously in other markets. One of the original screen grabs that Bissonnette showed was like he's up to it again. He's up to his old tricks, basically. So this is not something new. So I do find that interesting that this story flew under the radar when he was in Toronto. If he did this with Leafs, I found it interesting today. I was actually at the Leafs golf tournament, and they didn't make any players who played for Babcock available. Probably hoping, not to add fuel to the fire that's already burning in Columbus. But we spoke to 3 players, and all of them were new to the Leafs, never played for Babcock. So hope maybe even as early as tomorrow, when we talk to guys like Matthews and Marner, I'm sure they're going to get asked, was this photo sharing thing something that happened during his tenure there? I think his reputation was already kind of marred mostly by the Marner incident. He crossed the line. He admitted he crossed the line, and Blue Jackets thought, hey, let's give this guy a second chance, because years ago he was a Cup champion, and that carries a lot of weight in hockey, even if it's been a while. If you're a champion, you can find yourself getting jobs down the line. But looking forward, I wonder how this is going to affect, say, a guy like Joel Quenneville. If teams are, he wants back in. Right, Bill Peters wants back in. He's already back in North America, but I'm sure he wants back in the NHL. And if teams are looking at how swiftly this went sideways with Babcock, if they're like, this isn't worth it. Like, I know Joel Quenneville's a champ, and he can win games, and he can get good results. Probably, certainly knows the game, but maybe it's not worth it to from a PR standpoint, or even from a player relations standpoint, to hide a guy who's coming in with a little bit of baggage.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting, because it feels as though this might really muddy the way ownership and GMs look at bringing in maybe coaches that have definitely, as you said, tarnished resumes, to say the least, and in different ways than Babcock. To be fair, like he crossed the line, but he we don't have to go Kyle Beach or Bill Peters, because those are very different in and of themselves. But I want to transition as best as I can to the Leafs, the team you cover. So not much happened this offseason. It was quite, like I'm obviously kidding. Just what do you make of their offseason? Dubas gone, new tenure with Brad Treliving. Austin Matthews got that big contract. They still don't know about Nylander. Just how would you maybe assess the Leafs offseason and everything that changed and happened this summer?
Well, I could just tell you, sitting in that arena after they got swept, or not swept, but eliminated by the Florida Panthers in 5 games, and just from the high of being the Tampa Bay Lightning, of finally getting that monkey off their back, of winning a playoff series, and then to come out so flat against the Panthers and never really truly be in that series, there was a feeling like, all right, enough. There needs to be change. So I'm a little bit surprised if you were to ask me that night that the only significant change would be Kyle Dubas, that they'd run it back with the coach, that they'd run it back with the core four. I think I would have been surprised if you told me that night. Now, I guess what they're looking to do right now is just change the fringes, change the role players, and Brad Treliving kind of wasted no time in doing so, especially when it comes to the forwards, the type of forwards he brought in Ryan Reaves, which comes with question marks. No one really loves the 3-year term for a guy late in his 30s, who could be like one of those guys that they say should be healthy scratched if he can't keep up with the play. But he is trying to change the culture, bringing some sandpaper in. Kyle Dubas kind of tried to do that, but he would do it often at the trade deadline as kind of a patchwork method towards the later years. But Treliving's kind of getting out in front of that and saying, no, we want forwards with some edge. I'm a big fan of Tyler Bertuzzi signing. We'll have to see how it plays out, but I can certainly envision his style of crashing the crease and sticking up for teammates and, maybe getting under people's skin and not backing down. I think he could add to Matthews and Marner on the top line. Certainly he'll find a top 6 role for himself. I'm a big fan of that signing. And, Max Domi, I'm a little bit more medium on. Just I have questions about his defensive play. But, I was talking to him a little bit today and he was saying, I'm a utility guy. I'll play center. I'll play wing. Wherever they need me, I'm willing to chip in. And he should be motivated. He's on another 1-year deal. So you're getting a motivated Max Domi. Certainly is going to bring the passion, as the kids say, when he pulls on, that Maple Leaf sweater that his dad wore for so many years. So I think they're coming in with a little bit of a noisier group, a little bit of a more rugged group up front. On the back end, I'm not completely sold they have the right mix of defensemen yet. And I think the good thing for Leaf fans is I think Brad Treliving himself isn't quite satisfied with who he has back there, and what we see in October may not be what we see heading into the playoffs. I would be shocked if it is. The Klingberg 1-year deal, the flyer on him, that's kind of an interesting one.
Yeah.
I think it could be boom or bust. He could really add to the power play and generate some goals from the back end, which, as great of an offensive team as they are, they didn't really get a lot of goals from the back end. I think their leading defenseman goal-wise was Liljegren with 6, and Klingberg will crush that in a bad year. So but he brings defensive question marks. So he's a bit of an interesting one. To essentially go back with the Saints, to take William Nylander into the year, even though he doesn't have a contract settled, it's really interesting. Are the fringe changes that Treliving has made, is that enough? To get this team deep in the playoffs, because it's no longer about the regular season now. Like, it's getting ridiculous. They need to make a deep run, and even round 2 isn't enough anymore.
Yeah, and with that, I have, like, if you look at like the teams that they brought into training camp, obviously you mentioned about Kyle Dubas always changing and adding at the deadline, but how would you compare this team to other teams? Because I really think on paper this might be maybe their worst team in a couple of years to just ice out on opening night with maybe holes on depth forwards and you mentioned about the decor, like how and even question marks in net. How good do you think this team can be, even with maybe trade deadline acquisitions? Like, are they still a contender in your mind?
Yeah, absolutely. I think they're a contender, and I don't even know if they need to be as good of a regular season team as the past 2 years to be a contender, because you consider the 2 teams that are right there at the top of the Atlantic Division with them. I think Tampa's gotten a little step worse on paper. We can talk a lot right now until the games start, but on paper, I think they've taken a step back. They lost some key guys. They lost pretty much their 4th line. They lost Ross Colton. The salary cap constraints have finally caught up with them, and their core's getting a little bit older. I mean, they still have some weapons, but Boston in particular, I mean, to lose your number 1 center and your number 2 center, this game, you need center depth. And so I think the playing field Atlantic Division is going to even out a little bit. Ottawa, I think, is on the rise. Buffalo definitely is on the rise. Detroit, I have some question marks about their mix, but I think the gap between the top three and the pack has shrunk this offseason. And I think the Leafs are a contender to win their division. I think they're a good regular season team. I think that I also think he's going to make some changes onto the blue line. I don't love the mix of their bottom six. It feels like it doesn't quite have the right pieces. How are they going to fit together? I prefer David Camp as a 4C as opposed to a 3C. They're going to miss Ryan O'Reilly. That's a need, but very few teams do you look and say this team has no holes. I think they have enough talent that they're still going to be in the mix. I'd still call them a contender.
Where do you see or where are the sides at in the Nylander negotiations? It seems as though they've been all pretty far apart all summer. Just give kind of a little bit of an update where you see that and what kind of would make sense for both sides.
Yeah, very quiet, right? And maybe that's a good thing. Maybe they're taking one more run at it but before camp opens. But he's not scheduled to meet with reporters on first day of camp, which is interesting. He wasn't available today. I'm sure they're trying to downplay the circus that will surround him and his question mark of a future. But basically it comes down to money. This is a guy who feels like he's been, and rightly so, feels like his production and his contributions to the team have exceeded his current salary. He is going to get paid. And in a negotiation where the deadline really is until July 1, why not start high? Just because he's not signed before camp, I don't think Leaf fans need to panic and jump to the conclusion that means he's not going to sign. I believe he wants to be here. David Pastrnak, for example, didn't sign till second half of the season last year. Like, it's not that uncommon for a pending UFA to take things a little bit deeper. My big question in all of this is, does Treliving still want to keep with this formula that Dubas set forth? Does he still want, because if it's not 10, it's 9 something, like it's going to be a big number. So do you still want to spend that huge of a percentage of your cap on 4 forwards? They're going to get some relief in 2 years when John Tavares comes off the books. I could see him resigning, but at a lower rate. But Mitch Marner is going to get a raise, just like Austin did. He may get a higher number than Austin if he signs for longer term. Like, that's not out of the realm of possibility. The cap's going to be going up. So I think it's more philosophical. Do you want to be a team that continues to spend this abnormally large portion of your pie, your salary pie, on forwards? The Leafs spend more on their top forwards than any other team in the league, and it hasn't yielded playoff success yet.
And what would you make of maybe like the little glimpse of Treliving's ethos so far with the Matthews signing? Obviously, Leafs fans were very excited about it, but everyone looks at the term. Everyone looks now he's the highest paid player in the NHL. What can we kind of maybe glean from that from a management perspective?
Well, he said on the very day he was hired that this was his first priority, and he flew to Arizona to meet with them. It didn't play into it the whole picture, but he hired Shane Doan, who had a great relationship with Austin Matthews, and lives in the same area, right? Like, everything has kind of been geared towards, I got to lock this guy up. And I don't blame him. I mean, you have a number one center there. Another one's not coming along, especially if you look at the Leafs prospect pool. It's not like they have another Matthews on deck. So you got to keep him as long as possible. I think what's interesting most is the term. The fact that Matthews went 5 years. Usually these guys sign for 8 franchise centers at, as long as possible. It gives, from a personal standpoint, it gives Matthews another crack to add another payday when he's still relatively young. From the Leafs standpoint, maybe you want to revisit where the team's at. But right now, you got a bunch more years to go for it, and they're in win now mode. And I think it's a positive sign that, we were just talking about Nylander, that you remove any doubt about Matthews well before training camp, about a month before. You just clear that file. It also, I think, on Matthews, from Matthews' perspective, it sends a message to his teammates. I don't want to be a distraction. I'm on board here. I'm committed. You guys better get on board too. So I think from a leadership point of view, it makes a lot of sense, and from a business point of view, it makes a heck of a lot of sense for the guy too.
And just to go a bit to that, moving on to the goaltending, just how I know you wrote a little bit about Samsonov and Woll. Just what do you make of those two as a tandem? Like, how confident do you think the Leafs fans and the team should be in those two going into the season?
Fairly, but there's question marks. Woll's had some injuries in the past. He's shown well at the NHL level. In talking to him, I love the kid's attitude. I think he has the right mindset to stick in the NHL. Talking to people who know goaltending a lot better than me, they find he's very technically sound as well. So I think all the tools are there, but let's not put too much on him yet. He hasn't played a full NHL season, not even as a backup. Most of his experience is in the AHL. The NHL grind for a goalie is something, both mentally and physically, and you're facing better shooters. And this media market loves you. The fan base loves you when you're winning. But if you're a young goalie, and you lose 5 in a row or something, the fans could turn on you. The media could just call it as we see it. So, I think there's cautious optimism with Joseph Woll is how I'd put it. And it would be fantastic from the Leafs perspective to finally have a homegrown goalie. I think they really want that to happen. Doesn't help that he's dirt cheap on the cap for the next couple of years. And Samsonov is right back where he started. He thought he proved enough to get some term. They ended up taking him to arbitration and maybe walking him out the door as a UFA. So I think cost wise, I think they have a great tandem. But neither one has really carried the load. Like even last year, Samsonov, it was his best year. But he still, dealt with some injuries, wasn't the workhorse goalie that's going to give you 60 games. So between the two of them, and they brought in Martin Jones for insurance as well. It might be, I think they can get it done, but as has been the case with Leafs goalies past, staying healthy will be a major factor.
How short of a leash does a guy like Sheldon Keefe have going into this year?
I'd say that put it this way, I don't think his extension has affected his leash, because we're dealing with a cash rich team. But I also think as long as they're in the mix, as long as they're top 3 seed in the Atlantic, he's going to get a leash as long as the playoffs.
Okay.
Do they lose in round 1? I think he's under the gun. And I get it from Trey Living's perspective to give him an extension, because he did the same thing when he was hired by Calgary, saved a bullet, right? You don't have to fire the guy. He got to know him, convinced in his meetings with him, which were very intense, and he met with a lot of players as well. I think that's something important to point out. Like, behind the scenes, Austin Matthews said, "I can't play for this guy," or "I don't believe in this guy." I think we'd be looking at a different scenario. So the players have his back. They said they believe he's capable, and he hasn't lost the room yet. So I think that's important. So the players endorsed him, and it's in Trey Living's best interest not to burn a bullet. I'm very curious to see if Sheldon Keefe changes his ways, both tactically and maybe how hard he is on his players, now that he has a different GM too. Like, basically, Sheldon said to us that he's looking at this like it's a new job, a fresh start. So the dynamic is different, right? Him and Brad didn't know each other at all until Trey Living got hired, whereas him and Dubas went back like 3 jobs ago, right? So it's going to be kind of interesting, that new dynamic as well.
Yeah, and with that, like, just what do you make of the Dubas and Shanahan I guess, feud might be a good way to put it. And if, let's say, the Leafs lose in the first round or lose in the second round in the way that the fashion they did last year, is Brendan Shanahan on the hot seat, or is this just MLSE trusts him until they don't make the playoffs? Like, when does the culpability go to up top?
Yeah, no, I think he should be on the hot seat now. I
Mhm.
think we've reached that point. Yeah. Uh, you know, now we'll see. I'm hoping for a Pittsburgh Maple Leaf series.
Oh my gosh.
I think that'd be great theater.
Yeah.
Both men are being relatively polite and choosing their words carefully, but yeah, there's some bitterness on amongst this breakup. So and also just the fact that Pittsburgh is in kind of the same mindset. They are totally going for it with an older group, but like bringing in Erik Karlsson, like they are all in. So I can't wait for these two teams to face off. Actually,
How many times do you think sports is there a Saturday night game between the Leafs and Pittsburgh? Do you know that? I feel like
I don't know off by hand, but there should be.
there
Yeah.
should be. I'm just thinking about
Yeah.
all the camera shots of Dubas up there, and then there's
Mhm.
Shanahan comes and says hi, and it doesn't seem so. It looks a bit kind of awkward and all that kind of stuff. I'm excited.
Mhm.
I'm excited for the hockey season, but I have a question for you, Luke, because I truthfully, maybe this is my fan perspective, but are the Leafs considerably better or even better than the Sens going into this year? Because I feel the Sens might be better than them. I'm just being honest. I'm looking at the players on the ice, but just what do you make of that, and how excited would you be for a Leafs Sens first round playoff? I keep thinking about that because that could happen.
Well, it would be awesome because you know, the Scotiabank Arena games, the atmosphere is it's okay, but when the away games, the Leafs away games, when they
Oh,
go to Canada,
I know
the
that.
building is buzzing. I love it, and I've gone to, I don't know, a half dozen Leafs Sens games in Ottawa now, and they're always fun. Even with the Sens, not being in a playoff race, they're still fun. The crowd's really into it. Both teams seem to feed off that and get really into the game. And then it doesn't help that they've had some wild ones too. So
Yeah, that one.
I would absolutely love it. I love the fact that the Senators are creeping towards relevancy. I think Pierre Dorian's done a really fine job in going out of his way to lock up this core. We'll see how the core does, but at least he's been decisive and got a whole bunch of talented young guys to commit long term. And it's like, there's your team, there's your core. Of course, every summer there's going to be some new pieces around it, but you have a really strong nucleus. Do I think they're ready to take a giant step and finish ahead of the Leafs this season? I'd be surprised. I don't think the gap has shrunk that much.
Hmm.
I think they're still a little bit young, but I love the fact that they're in a position now to take a step, and it would not shock me at all for them to get into the playoffs. And if it's like Leafs Sens 2-3 seed or Leafs 1 seed and Sens get in a wild card spot, that's going to be an amazing ticket to have.
You wrote about the Sanderson contract, and you talked about Dorian locking in the core. What do you make of that contract? I know you liked it for the most part, but what kind of bet are the Sens making on with that kind of contract?
Well, it certainly comes with some risk, right? I think he's played 77 games,
Yep.
something like that. Like, to hand over that many millions of dollars, it's the opposite of a prove it contract, right? It's like, we believe in you. He still had another year on his entry level when he signed this contract. So those RFA years where he could have still been under club control for a bunch of years, usually are cheaper than UFA years, but they're kind of giving him almost UFA money now. So what that does is it alleviates the pressure of coming to that juncture where you're facing a guy and he's like, I might walk away. And Senators fans don't need to be reminded of the long list of guys who've done that.
Happened
I
this
mean,
summer.
it just happened with DeBrincat, right? So I think from that point of standpoint, you're just like removing all doubt. He's one of us. I've seen maybe 4 games of his live, and there's no way that kid looked like a rookie. Like his poise,
Good.
his raw skills. I'm really impressed by him. I still think it's very unique for him to get paid that much with so little experience. But I like what I've seen so far. This could end up looking like one of those steals down the road. And I think that's kind of the GM game. You can't always just let guys play out, because then the players have all the leverage. I mean, that's what's happening right now with Nylanders. It happened with Matthews because they didn't sign for 8 years. So at least you have this kid in his prime. And like I said, you got a number of building blocks in place, and now it's time for them to actually do it, to take a step.
From that to maybe the next face of the NHL and Connor Bedard, you wrote a little bit about him. Should I sell my Chicago tickets this year when they come here to Ottawa because Drake already cursed Connor Bedard? Is that what kind of expectations do you have for Bedard this year, Luke?
Well, just seeing some of the highlights from the rookie tournament, I don't know. I don't want to put a ceiling on this guy. He's just phenomenal. He's never. I mean, the NHL is a different beast. He's never been through the grind of all the travel, of a more condensed schedule. But anytime that any league this guy's played in, even as the youngest guy on the ice, he still puts up points and scores goals. He has, I was asked Connor McDavid what he thought of him, what stood out, and he's like, it's the shot. Like a lot of things you can teach a kid, but he has this deceptive shot, a hard shot for a guy who's not huge at all. But he's so great at that he can score from distance. There's not many guys that can do that. And he has, a creative mind. Cale Makar was another guy who was talking about him. He trained with him at the BioSteel camp in Halifax a few weeks ago, and he said his playmaking is off the charts. Like, just his vision, like, you don't think he's going to get the puck on your stick, and he does. Now, does he have enough weapons alongside him in Chicago? Maybe he single-handedly rejuvenates Taylor Hall's career. Like, let's see.
Yeah.
But points wise, I'm really curious to see. I don't know if you're in a fantasy draft,
Yeah.
but I'm in one in a few weeks, and I'm really curious to see what round this kid goes in, because I don't want to put a ceiling on him.
Ooh, what do you make? Like, do you think it's like where he's talking almost like Matthews rookie year, where he gets like close to 40 goals? Because that's what I'm like. Maybe that's just me being crazy, but I really think, as you said, the sky's the limit with this guy.
Yeah, it's possible.
Yeah.
It's possible. Yeah, that's probably a good bar.
Yeah.
I was in a scrum at the NHL Awards in Vegas with Connor Hellebuyck, and someone asked him to project Bedard's point total for the year, and he's like, probably 60. He's like, 60 points, probably a good number for rookie. And then he said, well, he's going to have to play me a few times, and there's 0 there. So I love that confidence from Hellebuyck, but I'm saying this kid gets more than 60.
Well, that's a great segue to my Jets. I just want to ask you quickly. I know you wrote just about like the Scheifele and Lindholm situation, but to focus just on the Jets, like, they really feel at a crossroads. It feels as though we say that every year for the past 2-3 years, with just the guys that are up and that they have to make decisions on. What do you think happens with Scheifele and Hellebuyck? Because it's guys going into their 30s. But do you want to lock them up? What's the term? What's the AAV? Just what do you think happens in Winnipeg?
Yeah, I think a lot depends on how the Jets perform. So I think if they're not a playoff team, if they've fallen out of the race by the time the trade deadline comes, I think they both move. I do. Yeah. Now, if they're in it, I think it's a different story, because this team feels like they need to go for it. So if they end up having they're not in full rebuild, scorched earth territory yet, and maybe that's because ownership doesn't want to. Maybe they're worried they could lose the fan base's attention a little bit. If they're not relevant, so they keep chasing it. In my personal opinion, I think they've just slowly been getting worse since 2018, and that was the year if they were going to make a cup final. I'm not a huge believer in the Jets right now, but hockey's wild. There's always a couple teams that surprise. So I think if they're in the mix, they'd probably just keep those guys and try and do some damage in the playoffs, get some playoff gate, and then we'll see from there. I mean, I think Scheifele, he has his flaws, but I think he could command a pretty penny. That article you're referencing, it's basically like Elias Lindholm and Mark Scheifele. Like, if those guys make it to market, there's no others. And there's going to be teams circling, like the Boston Bruins in particular.
What do you just make of like them, maybe like with the Jets? Like, is it wise at all to just walk them to UFA status? Because that makes no sense to me at all. Like, I get you want to make make the playoffs, maybe make gate revenue, but is that just really short-sighted?
Well, it doesn't make sense. But if you were going to trade them, or if you were 100% going to trade them, the time to do it would have been at the draft, because now it's most teams' rosters are pretty much set. It's a much more difficult trade to make at this point. Like I said, I think it will come down to how they're doing. If they're just a middling team, I absolutely think it makes more sense to manage the asset properly, because you could easily get a bidding war for both those guys going. Teams need centers. They need stud goalies. And even as a rental, now what they want to do if they do a trade is they want to, you get more value in return if the team you're trading him to already has an extension in place, right? Mm-hmm. But just on their current cap hits, they're relatively cheap and they're bargains, and it'd be worth a rental. So I think really this thing gets revisited closer. I think the deadline this year is March 8th. So, let's check back in February. If the Jets are surprising and they're second in the Central, I don't think they're going to trade them. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But if they're middle of the pack or falling out, then all bets are off.
Before I let you go, you wrote a little bit about Draisaitl and the Oilers being super locked in. In your mind, like, is this year finally their year, and how, like, are they the favorites or one of the 2 or 3 best teams in the league going into next year?
I think so. I think they're one of the 2 or 3 best teams in the West. I do not want to count out the Avalanche. I do not want to rule out a Vegas Golden Knights repeat. They're pretty much, Riley Smith aside, they're pretty much bringing back the same group. And I love how they won their cup, like with depth, rolling all 4 lines. Their 4th line would play against the other team's top 6. Their 3rd pair would log a ton of minutes. They could have 5 different goalies all year, and they still found a way. I'm a big fan of Bruce Cassidy. I think he's a really smart coach. So I'm not ruling out them. Are the Oilers amongst the group of contenders? Absolutely. I don't know if I've ever been around 2 guys on the same team that kind of have the eye of the tiger that McDavid and Draisaitl have. I only see them maybe 2-3 times a year in person and get to talk to them. But both of them, you can just feel that they want it so bad, so driven. And they both have a Hart Trophy. Like, they don't care that much about the individual stuff anymore. I think they really, and I also think they recognize that the future is uncertain for Draisaitl because of everything with hockey, the flat cap. There's only 2 more years guaranteed, 2 more cracks at it. Maybe they find a way, whoever the GM is in a couple of years, to keep both these guys together, but that's not guaranteed. And I think they're smart enough that they realize that, and the time is kind of now for them to get it done.
So just I'm gonna ask you just before I let you go. So who's your Stanley Cup? Way too early prediction. Who are your 2 favorites in the East and the West, and who's your favorite to win the Cup?
Well, I'll get some Canadian content in there. I'll say the Oilers in the West. But I'm going to throw the Carolina Hurricanes out there. I think they're a really balanced team. They keep knocking on the door, right? They've had some horrible semifinals, but I really like the culture that they have there. I'm a big believer in Rod Brind'Amour and the program he runs. I think they build a team the right way in terms of their depth on defense. And I like some of their offseason moves. So I'll go with the Hurricanes.
I just want to ask you quickly about you wrote about Rod Brind'Amour, just about what he did after they lost against the Panthers. Just maybe talk about that because I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah, so did I. So I was kind of a fly on the wall last week in Vegas, and I sat in on some sessions with the 32 Thoughts guys, Elliot and Jeff. And so if someone said something really newsy, they'd want me to spin a story out of it right away. And that was, mostly dominated with Bill Daly and Johnny Gaudreau talking about Mike Babcock. But the Seth Jarvis interview, and I haven't spent that much time around Seth Jarvis, but he was really insightful. And I love the story he told about how after they got swept by the Florida Panthers, Rod Brind'Amour, who's known for these rousing speeches and his great, pregame or postgame pep talks, kind of went into the room, saw all the guys with their heads hung, and they were just absolutely gutted. They lost to a team that they thought they were better than. They had home ice advantage, but they got swept. Good teams lost again, and he didn't say a word. Seth Jarvis said, because basically the coach knew that words wouldn't matter at that point, that, there was nothing he could say to cheer them up. But what he did was he sat down in the dressing room just beside them, like he was one of them. And Jarvis said it was like he had been on the ice with us. And I thought that was just really cool. And I think a lot of that stems from Brind'Amour being a player himself, and he's in there working out in the gym alongside his players. Like if there is a guy who's as close to being one of his players, it's Rod. So I thought that was a really cool touch, and it was also neat that Seth Jarvis took note of it, right? Like he could have just gave a cliche answer about, we were disappointed, but we'll come back. But he made a point to paint that scene. So I thought that was cool.
I'd just love to see video or pictures of Rod Brind'Amour benching way more than like everyone on the Canes. I think that guy's a freak and
Yeah.
has amazing work ethic. So just a gym rat. But Luke, thanks so much for doing this. Anything at Sportsnet that you want to plug before I let you go?
No, not in particular. I mean, Tuesday morning, my Leafs camp preview comes out. So Leaf fans, if you want to know about the battles, or you want to know who I'm predicting to make the opening night roster, it's all in there. So you can check that out. But yeah, thanks for having me on, Alex.
Thanks so much, Luke. Everyone should check out your work. It's second to none on the Leafs. And thanks so much for doing this, especially on a day like today. So thank you, Luke.
Awesome. Appreciate it. Thanks.